The fluorescent lights of the Havenwood Town Hall hummed the same monotonous note they had for 40 years. It was a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. From my oak desk, perched just to the right of the council dais, I watched him work. Mayor Richard Thorne. He wasn't just a mayor. He was a phenomenon, a summer storm that had rolled into our quiet New England valley and convinced everyone it was a blessing. He spoke of transparency like it was a new kind of gospel, and the town, hungry for salvation from rising taxes and dwindling prospects, had anointed him their savior. He had a smile that could disarm a bear trap and eyes that held your gaze just a little too long, making you feel like you were the only person in the world. But I see things differently. I see the mechanics beneath the charm. I see the gears turning behind the eyes. It's what a clerk does. We observe. We record. We are the institutional memory, the quiet bedrock beneath the shifting sands of politics. For weeks I'd watched his particular brand of transparency in action. I saw him corner old Arthur Finch by the water cooler, his voice a low, friendly murmur. But I saw Arthur's hand tremble as he reached for a paper cup. The next day, Arthur, a man who had staunchly opposed the industrial rezoning of Miller's Creek for a decade, voted in favor of it without a word of debate. His eyes were fixed on the scuffed toes of his shoes the entire time. I saw it, and I recorded it. Not in the public minutes, of course. The public minutes said Councilman Finch voted yay. But in my private log, in the coded system my predecessor taught me, the entry was far more detailed. A small, almost invisible symbol of a coiled snake next to Arthur's name, and a notation on the humidity in the room, my code for suffocating pressure. Thorne thought I was a relic, a sweet old woman, a piece of the town's quaint furniture. He'd even said as much, patting my hand during his first press conference. He said it is so reassuring to see the traditions upheld by dedicated public servants like Mrs. Gable. He thought my meticulous handwritten notes were a charming anachronism. He had no idea. He had no idea that those notes were a weapon, forged over decades, waiting for an enemy worthy of them. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or erased in your own life, stick around. You're going to want to hear this. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a boss or a colleague who smiled to your face while sharpening a knife behind your back, because it helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void here. The inciting incident, the moment the ground shifted beneath my feet, wasn't a loud explosion. It was a whisper. The final vote on the controversial Northgate development project was on the agenda. It was Thorne's magnum opus, a luxury condo complex that promised new revenue but would displace 24 families and bulldoze the last patch of wild forest in Havenwood. The vote was balanced on a knife's edge. It all came down to Beatrice Cole, a young, earnest councilwoman, a mother of 3 who had campaigned on protecting our town's character. She was a firm known. Before the meeting began, Thorne called for a brief 5-minute recess. He gestured for Beatrice to join him in the anteroom, his smile as wide and welcoming as a summer's day. I watched them through the small glass pane in the door. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw the paternal way he placed a hand on her shoulder. I saw him show her something on his phone. I saw the color drain from Beatrice's face, a sudden sickening vacancy in her eyes. It was like watching a light switch off. She looked past Thorne, her eyes desperately searching the main hall, and for a moment, they met mine. It was a look of pure, animal terror. When they returned, Beatrice was a ghost. Thorne called the meeting back to order, his voice booming with confidence. When the roll was called, Beatrice Cole, her voice a thin, reedy thing I barely recognized, voted yay. A gavel fell. A deal was done, and a town was sold. Thorne, drunk on his victory, stood at the podium and delivered a speech about a new era of progress, and then he looked directly at me. He said, "And to ensure our governance is as modern and efficient as our vision, we will be moving to digitize all town records. We'll be bringing in a consultant to streamline the clerk's office, to bring it into the 21st century. He called it an upgrade, a modernization. I knew what it was. It was an execution. My execution. He was erasing the record keeper. He was getting rid of the one person who saw what he'd done to Beatrice Cole, the one person who not only saw it, but knew how to write it down. He smiled that charming smile again, and the room applauded his foresight. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at my ledger, open on the desk. I uncapped my fountain pen, the one with the special blend of iron gall ink, and next to the entry for Beatrice Cole's vote, I drew a single, perfect teardrop, my code for a soul compromised under duress. It was then that I knew. The State Ethics Commission was about to receive a very, very interesting package, and my work, the real work, was just beginning. It was never about revenge. It was about the record. The record always has to be set straight. The town hall emptied out. The sounds of triumphant backslapping and self-congratulation fading down the marble corridors, until the only sound left was that familiar monotonous hum of the old lights. I sat at my desk, my hand resting on the heavy, leather-bound volume of this year's minutes. The spine was still stiff, the gold leaf lettering still bright. Havenwood Municipal Records, Year of Our Lord, 2023. It felt warm to the touch, like a living thing. The shock hadn't really hit me yet. It was a distant, cold thing, a block of ice forming in the pit of my stomach. Thorne's announcement wasn't just about a job. It wasn't about a pension. Though 40 years of service should count for something, it was about this room, these books, this sacred silent duty that had defined the entire shape of my adult life. He was taking my place. He was silencing my pen. He was trying to burn the library. I packed my briefcase with a slow, deliberate calmness that I did not feel. My hands were steady, my motions practiced, but inside, a tremor had started. When I finally stood, my knees buckled slightly. I had to grip the edge of the old oak desk, my knuckles white against the dark, polished wood, the same wood I had polished myself every Friday for 4 decades. The walk to my car in the near-empty lot felt a mile long. Each footstep echoed, a lonely sound in the cool New England night. When I finally slipped behind the wheel of my sensible sedan, the tremor in my gut gave way. A wave of something hot and sharp washed over me, and I leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the steering wheel. The professional composure, the armor I had worn for a lifetime, finally cracked. I didn't sob. I didn't scream. It was a quiet, ragged sound that escaped my lips, the sound of something breaking deep inside. 40 years of showing up before the sun, of making sure the coffee was brewed for the early selectmen meetings, of typing up zoning ordinances until my fingers ached, of listening, always listening. I had served 7 mayors. I had recorded the births and deaths of 100 town initiatives. I had been the constant, the anchor, the one thing people could rely on in a world of political whims. And it was all to be swept away by a charming sociopath and a digital consultant who probably thought posterity was a brand of artisanal coffee. He called me a relic. Maybe he was right. In that moment, in the dark solitude of my car, I felt like one. An artifact in a museum nobody visited anymore. My mind, unbidden, flew back through time. I wasn't in the town hall parking lot anymore. I was a young woman, barely 23, standing in the very same office, my heart thumping with a nervous pride. My hair was dark then, and I wore a dress my mother had made for my first day. The office was dominated by the presence of one person, Mrs. Eleanor Pynchon. She was the town clerk then, a woman carved from New England granite. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that was perpetually set in a firm, no-nonsense line. She was terrifying, and she was my new boss. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my neatly polished shoes. She said, "So, you think you have what it takes to be a clerk, do you, girl?" I stammered something about being a fast typist and having taken meticulous notes in college. She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture I would come to know well. "That's secretarial work," she said, her voice raspy from a lifetime of unfiltered cigarettes, a habit she kept hidden from the public. "A clerk does more. A clerk watches. A clerk listens. A clerk understands that what is said at that podium is only half the story, the less important half." She pulled a massive, heavy ledger from the shelf behind her. It was bound in dark green leather, cracked with age. She opened it on the desk between us. The pages were filled with her elegant, spidery script. To my young eyes, it was just a record of meetings. But then she began to explain. "Look here," she said, tapping a long, bony finger on a page from 1958. "See how the ink on Councilman Miller's name is a fraction darker than the others?" He pressed too hard. Why? Because he was angry. The proposal was for a new school, and his brother-in-law was the only builder in town who didn't get to bid. He voted yes, but his pen tells me he was furious. He was coerced. A week later, his brother-in-law got the contract for the new fire station. "See? The story isn't in the yay or nay, it's in the ink. It was a revelation. It was a secret world opening up to me. Over the next 10 years, Eleanor Pynchon became my mentor, my guide, my second mother. She taught me everything. She taught me about the hidden language of the minutes, the Pynchon Code, she called it, with a rare, crooked smile. It wasn't just about the pressure of the pen, it was a whole system. A slight change in the page margin for a secret meeting held before the official one. A specific type of paper, rag-based instead of wood pulp, for a vote that involved a significant land deal. A subtle marker of its gravity. A tiny, almost imperceptible watermark, a drop of tea strategically spilled and blotted to denote a bribe offered or accepted. A quill pen symbol, small as a fly speck, drawn in the tail of a Y for a whispered threat. She had a symbol for everything. Blackmail, nepotism, secret alliances, cowardice, integrity. She would drill me after every meeting. What did you see, Alara? What did you really see? Who was looking at whom when the timber contract was discussed? Whose knuckles were white? Who wouldn't meet your eye? She taught me to observe the invisible currents in the room, the subtle shifts in power and fear that dictated every outcome. It's for posterity, Alara, she'd say, her voice low and serious as she locked the volumes away in the fireproof vault each night. Most of these men are good men, but power is a slow poison, and people forget. The minutes must not forget. The minutes must remember for them. The memory was so vivid, I could almost smell the faint scent of her lavender water and stale cigarette smoke in my car. The cold block of ice in my stomach began to melt, replaced by a slow rising heat. Eleanor had seen men like Thorne before. They came in different packages with different slogans, but their hunger was always the same. She had prepared me for this. This wasn't just my job he was taking. It was my duty. It was Eleanor's legacy. He wasn't just firing a clerk. He was trying to burn down the library of Havenwood's sins, and I was the librarian. The honk of a passing car jolted me back to the present. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The despair was gone. In its place was a feeling I hadn't felt in years. A cold, hard, diamond-sharp resolve. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about the integrity of the record. It was for Eleanor. It was for posterity. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming to life, I allowed myself a small, private thought. It was also, just a little bit, about seeing the look on Richard Thorne's face when he realized the quiet, quaint old woman in the corner had been keeping a second set of books all along. The drive home was different. I didn't see the familiar houses or the sleeping storefronts. I saw a chessboard. I saw 40 years of meticulously placed pieces that no one else knew were even on the board. When I got home, I didn't turn on the television or make a cup of tea. I went straight to the heavy oak bookshelf in my study, the one I had inherited from my father. Behind a row of leather-bound classics, I pressed a knot in the wood. A hidden latch clicked. A section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a small, climate-controlled alcove. Inside, stacked in neat chronological order, were 40 identical volumes, my private copies. Every night, for 40 years, I had taken a carbon copy of my notes home. I had transcribed the public record. And then, on a fresh page, I had transcribed the true record. The one written in the Pynchon Code. It was all there. Every lie, every threat, every secret deal. A complete, unbroken history of Havenwood's shadow governance. I pulled down the volume for the year Thorne arrived. The beginning. I ran my hand over the embossed cover. The catalyst for my action wasn't just his threat to my job. It was the look in Beatrice Cole's eyes. It was the memory of Eleanor Pynchon's fierce, protective gaze. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that if I did nothing, 40 years of silent witness would mean absolutely nothing. It would all be for naught. The record would be broken. The library would burn. I opened the book. The faint smell of ink and old paper filled the air. It was the smell of truth. And I was going to make sure everyone in Havenwood, and perhaps a few people at the state capitol, were about to get a good, strong whiff of it. The plan didn't form in a single flash of insight. It assembled itself in my mind, piece by piece, like the intricate workings of a clock. For 2 days, I did nothing. I went to work, performed my duties with the same placid efficiency as always, and smiled my serene, grandmotherly smile at Mayor Thorne whenever he strode past my desk. He saw me as a defeated old woman playing out the clock, a harmless fixture he would soon replace with a server rack and a software license. The condescension was a cloak. It was the best camouflage I could have asked for. "Let them think you are a sheep," Eleanor used to say, "and they will never see the wolf hiding inside." At night, my small house became a war room. The dining table was covered in ledgers, my private copies spread out like a secret history of our town. The first step was transcription and translation. The Pynchon code was a language unto itself, rich with nuance. I couldn't just hand a book of symbols to the Ethics Commission. They would dismiss it as the ramblings of a vengeful eccentric. I needed to build a case. I needed a Rosetta Stone. I started with the most recent events, working my way backward. Each coded entry was cross-referenced, footnoted, and explained in plain, unequivocal language. The teardrop symbol next to Beatrice Cole's name became a detailed, one-page memo titled "Re-coercion of Councilwoman B. Cole prior to Northgate development vote." I described the recess, the anteroom meeting, the change in her demeanor, the look of terror in her eyes. I noted the exact time. I even noted the make and model of the smartphone Thorne had used to show her whatever it was that broke her will. Beside the coiled snake I'd drawn for Arthur Finch's vote, I wrote an even longer memo. I dug into the public archives, pulling the records for the Millers Creek rezoning and the subsequent awarding of contracts. I cross-referenced it with my coded notes from 10 years prior, when Arthur's son had gotten into some legal trouble, a DUI that had mysteriously vanished from the court docket after a quiet chat between the then mayor and the police chief. My notes from that week, marked with a tiny icon of a scale, unbalanced, showed Arthur had been compromised long before Thorne ever arrived. Thorne hadn't created the corruption, he had just inherited its infrastructure. He was a master at finding the old wounds and pressing on them. This process was painstaking, a meticulous archaeology of whispers and glances. I would work until 3 in the morning, fueled by black tea and a cold, burning sense of purpose. I'd sleep for a few hours and be back at my desk in the town hall by 7, smelling of lavender soap, looking as harmless as ever. During this time, I thought a lot about Eleanor. I remembered her last days, when she was frail and bedridden, her sharp mind still flickering behind clouded eyes. I had visited her every day. She made me promise to maintain the private record. "It's a burden, Elara," she had whispered, her hand clutching mine, a heavy one. "Most of the time you will record things that are merely foolish or vain, but one day, a true wolf will come to the door. Not a stray dog, but a wolf. He will smile, and he will look like a shepherd, and on that day these books will be the only thing that can protect the flock. You'll know him when you see him. I knew him now. I saw him every day. As I built my case, I realized I needed an outside element. I couldn't just mail a box of paper to the state capitol. It needed a narrative. It needed a public face, a spark to light the kindling I was so carefully arranging. That spark walked into my office on a Tuesday afternoon. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was young, probably not much older than I was when I first met Eleanor. She had a reporter's hungry eyes and the slightly rumpled look of someone who cared more about the story than her wardrobe. She wrote for the Havenwood Chronicle, our small local paper that was more known for its coverage of the annual bake sale than for hard-hitting investigative journalism. She introduced herself and asked, with a directness that I immediately respected, about the Northgate vote. She said, "Mrs. Gable, I was at the meeting. I saw Councilwoman Cole before and after the recess. Something happened in that anteroom. Do you have any idea what it was?" I looked at her, my face a mask of benign confusion. I said, "My dear, it was a simple recess. The mayor and the councilwoman had a brief discussion. The public minutes reflect the final vote. That is all I am at liberty to say. It was a test, a crucial one. Would she accept the official story and walk away, or would she push?" Her jaw tightened slightly, a flash of frustration in her eyes. "I can see why Eleanor chose me all those years ago. I recognize that same fire in this young woman." She pressed, "But the vote made no sense. It went against everything she campaigned on. People in her district are furious. They feel betrayed." I just kept my calm, placid demeanor. "I am sorry, Miss Jenkins, but my job is to record what happens, not to speculate on why. I can give you a copy of the official minutes if you'd like." I was dismissing her, but I was also challenging her. I was showing her the stone wall and daring her to find a way around it. She left my office that day with a copy of the bland, useless public record, and I knew she was frustrated. But I also knew she wasn't giving up. She was the one. She would be the one to tell the story. I just had to decide how to give it to her. My hidden leverage wasn't just the code, it was the sheer, overwhelming volume of it. 40 years of data. Thorne's corruption was a single, ugly chapter in a much larger book. To expose him, I had to expose the system of quiet favors and gentlemen's agreements that had allowed a man like him to flourish. I had to show that he wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper sickness. A sickness Eleanor had been diagnosing for half a century. The subplot of my own life wove through the pages. I found the entry from the year my husband David passed away. The meeting was just 2 days after his funeral. I didn't miss it. The then mayor, a decent man named Peterson, had told me to take all the time I needed. But I knew a critical budget vote was happening. I knew a particular councilman was planning to sneak in a rider to benefit his construction company. So I went. I sat at my desk, dressed in black, my heart a hollow space in my chest. And I recorded the lie when the councilman swore his rider was for the public good. The code for that entry was a simple black border around the page, my private symbol for grief, but also for a duty performed in the face of personal desolation. This work was who I was. It was all I had left. Thorne was not just threatening my job, he was desecrating a memorial. My plan needed one more element, an ally on the inside. My assistant, a quiet, hyper-efficient woman named Maria, had worked for me for 15 years. She was fiercely loyal, and she saw the same things I did, though we never spoke of it. She revered the office and its traditions. The day after Thorne's announcement, she came to my desk, her face pale. She asked, "Is it true, Mrs. Gable? Are you leaving?" I looked at her and saw the genuine distress in her eyes. I said, "The mayor has a new vision for the office, Maria." She sniffed, a rare display of emotion. "It's not right. This place is you." I reached across the desk and put my hand on hers. I said, "The institution is stronger than any one person, but I will need your help with something. I need you to make a full archival copy of the last 3 years of digital records, memos, emails, building permits, everything, and I need you to do it quietly." Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between us. She wasn't just my assistant anymore. She was my co-conspirator. She simply nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Gable, for the archives." Over the next week, as I finalized my dossier of translated secrets, Maria was my ghost in the machine. She worked through her lunches, staying late, quietly duplicating gigabytes of data onto an encrypted hard drive. This was the corroborating evidence. My coded notes were the map of the crimes, the digital records were the photographs of the crime scenes, the emails from Thorne's office to the developer, the permit applications that were fast-tracked, the internal memos discussing the political optics of the Northgate project. It was all there. Finally, one rainy Thursday night, it was done. My dining table was clear. The ledgers returned to their secret home. On the table sat a single, plain cardboard box. Inside was a 3-inch binder, neatly tabbed and organized, containing the decoded truth of Richard Thorne's reign. Beside it lay a small, encrypted thumb drive. My life's work, condensed into a weapon. Now all I had to do was aim it, and I knew my first target wasn't Thorne himself. That would come later. The first move had to be subtle. It had to be a single stone tossed into the placid surface of the pond, and I knew exactly which one to throw. I picked up the phone and dialed the main number for the Havenwood Chronicle. I asked for Sarah Jenkins. When she answered, her voice tired and wary, I didn't give my name. I just said, "You were asking about the Northgate vote. You're looking in the wrong place. Look at Arthur Finch's campaign finance reports from 2 years ago. Compare them to the property transfer records for the old cannery on River Street." Then I hung up. The first move had been made. The silence was about to be broken. The day after my anonymous call to Sarah Jenkins, the air in the town hall felt different. It was a subtle shift, a change in barometric pressure that only someone like me would notice. Mayor Thorne was still his usual effervescent self, all teeth and charisma, but there was a new tension in his shoulders, a wire pulled just a little too tight. He was a predator, and predators are attuned to the slightest disturbance in their environment. He knew something was off, but he didn't know what. He probably thought it was just the lingering resentment over the Northgate vote. He had no idea that a seed had been planted in the fertile ground of his own corruption. I watched him from my desk, my expression one of serene indifference. I was just Mrs. Gable, the town clerk, counting down her final days, a living fossil. It was the perfect cover. 2 days later, Sarah's article appeared. It wasn't on the front page. It was a modest column on page 3 of the Chronicle, tucked between a story about a lost cat and the high school football scores. The headline was unassuming. Questions arise over campaign donations and cannery sale. It was a masterpiece of careful journalism. Sarah didn't make any direct accusations. She simply laid out the facts, just as I had led her to them. She reported that Arthur Finch's re-election campaign had received a surprisingly large, last-minute donation from a holding company. A holding company that, with a little digging, she had traced back to a principal investor in the Northgate development project. Then, she reported that just weeks after the election, a derelict property owned by Arthur's wife, the old cannery, had been sold to that very same holding company for nearly 3 times its assessed market value. There was no mention of blackmail, no mention of Mayor Thorne. It was just a quiet, factual presentation of a timeline that didn't add up. It was a pinprick, but it was a pinprick in a dangerously inflated balloon. The effect was immediate. I saw Arthur Finch in the hallway that morning. He was holding the newspaper, his hand shaking so badly the paper rustled. His face, normally ruddy and cheerful, was the color of ash. He saw me looking and flinched, scurrying into his office like a frightened rabbit. Later that day, the door to Thorne's office slammed shut with a crack that echoed through the building. Through the frosted glass, I could see 2 silhouettes, Thorne's tall, sharp frame and Arthur's slumped, defeated one. The voices were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Thorne was furious. The predator was wounded, and he was lashing out at the weakest member of his pack. This was the first domino. Arthur was a known quantity, a man whose compromises were an open secret to anyone who cared to look. By exposing him first, I had sent a message to the other, more recently compromised members of the council. A message that said, "Your secrets are not safe. The alliance you made with Thorne is built on sand." I saw it in their eyes at the next Public Works Committee meeting. Beatrice Cole sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Another councilman, a hardware store owner named Frank, who had inexplicably voted for a town-wide contract with a hardware supplier that was a direct competitor to his own business, kept wiping sweat from his brow even though the room was cool. They were starting to understand that the protection Thorne had offered them was an illusion. Their complicity was a cage, and they were beginning to rattle the bars. Thorne, for his part, tried to control the narrative. At a press conference, he dismissed Sarah's article as the kind of small-town rumor-mongering that distracts from our important work. He praised Arthur Finch as a dedicated public servant who was being unfairly maligned by a cub reporter trying to make a name for herself. He was trying to suffocate the story with his charisma, to smother the small flame of truth before it could catch. It was a classic bully tactic, discredit the messenger, but he made a critical mistake. He underestimated Sarah Jenkins, and he underestimated the power of a well-aimed fact. My next anonymous call to Sarah was 2 days later. This time, I gave her a name, Frank Miller, the hardware store owner. I told her to look into the shipping manifests for the town's new maintenance contract. Look for irregularities. Look for shipments that were signed for but never delivered. I was guiding her, giving her the threads. I knew she had the tenacity to pull them. Meanwhile, Maria, my quiet, loyal Maria, was my eyes and ears. She would tell me about the panicked phone calls, the closed-door meetings, the frayed tempers in the mayor's office. She told me Thorne had hired an IT consultant to audit the town's servers. He was looking for a leak. He was hunting for the source of his problems, never once suspecting that the source was sitting in plain sight, calmly stamping documents and smiling benignly at him every morning. The true panic began when Sarah's second article hit. This one was on the front page. Havenwood maintenance contract under scrutiny. She had found the ghost shipments. She had found invoices for materials that were never received. She had uncovered a clear pattern of fraud that implicated not only Frank Miller, but the developer who had won the contract, the same developer behind Northgate. The story was no longer about one disgruntled councilman. It was a pattern. The pinprick had become a gash. The public narrative of transparent governance was bleeding out. Phone calls started flooding the town hall. Citizens were showing up at the front desk, demanding answers. The local news station from the city sent a van. For the first time since he had swept into town, Richard Thorne was on the defensive. He was losing control of the story, and it was driving him mad. He grew leaner, meaner. The charming smile became a tight, forced grimace. His easy confidence was replaced by a brittle, aggressive arrogance. He was cornered, and a cornered animal is a dangerous one. I knew his next move would be directed at me. He had to suspect, on some level, that the old records, the institutional memory he was so eager to erase, were somehow being used against him. He was a man who only understood power and leverage. The idea that someone could act out of a sense of duty or historical integrity was completely alien to him. He assumed I must have a price. He assumed I could be bought or intimidated. He was about to learn how wrong he was. He was about to come face to face with a force he couldn't comprehend, a woman with nothing left to lose, armed with 40 years of the truth. The silent takeover was well underway. The foundation of his power, built on secrets and fear, was cracking, and he had no idea that the architect of his destruction was the little old lady he had so carelessly dismissed. The power shift didn't happen in a boardroom or on a trading floor. It happened in the aisles of the local grocery store, at the counter of the town diner, and in the pews of the old congregational church. The whispers started, tentative at first, then growing in volume and confidence. Sarah Jenkins's reporting had given the town a new vocabulary. Words like holding company, kickback, and conflict of interest were suddenly part of the everyday chatter. The awe that had surrounded Richard Thorne was curdling into suspicion. He was no longer the charismatic savior. He was just another politician with his hand in the cookie jar. The client exodus, in my world, was the flight of allegiance. The council members whom Thorne had so confidently controlled were now liabilities. Their fear of him was being eclipsed by a greater fear, the fear of public exposure. I saw Beatrice Cole at the farmer's market that Saturday. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She was buying apples, her hands trembling as she counted out her change. Our eyes met across a pyramid of brightly colored squash. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of collusion. It was a nod of understanding. It was a silent acknowledgement of the cage she was in. I was letting her know that she wasn't alone. I was letting her know that there was a way out. That small gesture, that moment of shared humanity, was more powerful than any of Thorne's threats. The next day, Beatrice Cole did the bravest thing she had ever done. She called Sarah Jenkins. She didn't confess, not yet, but she spoke, off the record, about the immense pressure to approve projects that were not in the town's best interest. She was the first crack in the wall of silence. She was the first of Thorne's victims to fight back. Her anonymous quotes in Sarah's next article were explosive. It was no longer just about financial misdeeds. It was about a culture of intimidation emanating from the mayor's office. The narrative had shifted decisively. Thorne was no longer just corrupt. He was a bully. He was a tyrant. And in a small New England town that still celebrated Patriots' Day with historical reenactments, there was no dirtier word. Thorne knew he was losing. The tide of public opinion, which had carried him so triumphantly into office, was now pulling him out to sea. He had to do something drastic. He had to reassert his dominance. He called a special town-wide meeting. The stated purpose was to address the recent unfounded allegations and to reaffirm this administration's commitment to open and transparent governance. I knew its real purpose. It was a show trial. He was going to put Sarah Jenkins and her reporting in the dock. He was going to use the power of his office and the force of his personality to crush the dissent and cow his opposition back into line. It was a desperate, arrogant move. The day before the meeting, he summoned me to his office. It was the first time I had ever been inside. It was decorated in a cold, modern style that was completely at odds with the rest of the historic building. Chrome and black leather, it looked like the office of a man who didn't plan on staying long. He was standing by the window, looking out over the town green. He didn't turn around when I entered. He said, "Mrs. Gable, Alara, 40 years is a long time, a legacy to be proud of." His voice was smooth as silk, but I could feel the steel beneath it. I stood silently, my hands clasped in front of me. He turned, that famous smile plastered on his face. It didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, dead things. "I hear you're looking forward to your retirement," he said. "We're planning a lovely tribute for you. But this recent unpleasantness, it's cast a pall over things. I want your transition to be a happy one." He walked over to his desk and picked up an envelope. "The town council has approved a discretionary bonus in recognition of your long service, a very generous one, enough to ensure a very comfortable retirement." He slid the envelope across the polished desk, It was his desperate counter-offer. The bribe, the final, clumsy attempt to use the only tool he knew, money. He thought he was buying my silence. He thought he was buying my complicity. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at him. I thought of Eleanor Pynchon, her fierce integrity burning bright even as her body failed her. I thought of Beatrice Cole's terrified eyes. I thought of 40 years of silent witness, of the sacred duty I had sworn to uphold. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the record. I met his cold gaze and spoke, my voice quiet but clear. "Thank you, Mayor Thorne, but that won't be necessary. My pension is quite adequate." His smile faltered. The mask slipped for just a second, revealing the raw fury beneath. He wasn't used to being told no. He said, "I would reconsider if I were you, Alara. Loyalty is a valuable commodity in this town. It would be a shame to end such a long and distinguished career on a sour note." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern, the final play of a desperate man. I gave him a small, serene smile, the same smile he had mistaken for weakness for months. I said, "My loyalty is to this office, Mr. Thorne, not to the person who temporarily occupies it. The record will reflect that." I turned and walked out of his office, leaving the envelope untouched on his desk. The power had shifted completely. He just didn't know it yet. He thought tomorrow's meeting was his stage. He had no idea it was his scaffold. And I had already delivered the rope. The box, my life's work, had been sent by courier to the state capitol 2 days ago. It had been delivered, signed for, and was now in the hands of the chief investigator for the State Ethics Commission. The silent takeover was complete. All that was left was the public detonation. The town hall was packed. Every seat was taken, and people were standing 3 deep along the back and side walls. The air was thick with anticipation, a tense electric silence that felt heavier than any noise. The city news crews were there, their cameras pointed at the dais like a firing squad. This was Thorne's show, his last stand, and the whole world, or at least our small corner of it, was watching. I was in my usual place, at my oak desk, the blank page of a new ledger open before me. I felt a strange sense of calm, the deep, placid stillness that comes after a storm has passed. I had done the work. I had honored Eleanor's legacy. The rest was just noise. Thorne strode to the podium, a portrait of defiant confidence. He surveyed the crowd, his politician's smile firmly in place. He began to speak, his voice resonating with the practiced cadence of a man who believes in the power of his own words. He spoke of progress. He spoke of vision. He spoke of the forces of stagnation and enemies of the future who were trying to drag Havenwood back into the past. He was painting a picture of himself as a noble warrior, beset by petty, jealous pygmies. He was talking about me, of course, without using my name. And he was talking about Sarah Jenkins, who sat in the front row, her notebook open, her expression unreadable. He was building to his crescendo. The moment he would try to publicly discredit her, to tear her reporting to shreds. He said, "And now we have a so-called journalist, a person with no ties to our community, who prints baseless smears and innuendo, all in an effort to—" He never got to finish the sentence. The main doors of the hall swung open. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in plain dark business suits, entered the room. They moved with a quiet, purposeful authority that immediately commanded attention. The crowd murmured, parting to let them through. They walked directly to the dais. One of the men approached Thorne, who had stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. The man handed him a thick envelope. He said, in a voice that was not loud but carried to every corner of the silent room, "Mayor Richard Thorne, you are hereby served with a notice of formal investigation by the State Ethics Commission." The woman then moved down the line, handing identical envelopes to Arthur Finch and Frank Miller. Beatrice Cole watched, her face a mask of terror and relief. The flash of a dozen cameras went off at once, the sound like a volley of gunfire. The room erupted. Thorne stood frozen for a moment, the envelope in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. His face, which had been a mask of confident charm just seconds before, had crumbled. It was a ruin of disbelief and pure, undiluted rage. His eyes scanned the room, wild and desperate, searching for the source of his undoing, and then they landed on me. He saw me, sitting calmly at my desk, my pen poised over my ledger. The truth finally dawned on him, the full, horrifying scope of his miscalculation. He saw the relic, the quaint old woman, the piece of furniture, and he finally understood that the furniture had been listening. He took a step toward me, his face contorted. He opened his mouth, and a low guttural sound came out, a hiss of pure venom. He said, you old. I looked up at him, my expression unchanged. I met his hateful gaze with the serene calm of a clear winter morning, and I delivered the line I had been saving for months. It was something he had said to me in one of our first meetings, a piece of casual, condescending advice. He had been talking about some old, forgotten town bylaw. He had laughed and said, "History is written by the winners, Mrs. Gable. No one cares about the dusty old records." I looked him in the eye and said quietly but with a clarity that cut through the chaos, "You were wrong, Mr. Thorne. History is not written by the winners, it is written by the clerk. And the minutes, as I was taught, remember everything." Then I looked down at my ledger, and with a steady hand, I made my final entry on the reign of Richard Thorne. A simple, elegant symbol Eleanor had taught me for an evil vanquished. A perfect, 5-pointed star. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Thorne resigned the next morning, his letter a pathetic, self-pitying screed about a political witch hunt. Arthur Finch and Frank Miller followed suit within the week. The Northgate development deal was suspended, then cancelled. The state's investigation, buoyed by my meticulously organized evidence, moved with uncommon speed. There would be trials. There would be consequences. The system, for once, was working. A special election was called to build a new town council from the scratch of its own disgrace. I stayed on for another 3 months, helping the interim government navigate the chaos. I trained my replacement, a bright young woman who had the same fire in her eyes that I once had, that I saw in Sarah Jenkins. I taught her the proper way to format the public minutes, the importance of archival paper, the correct procedures for sealing and storing the town records. One afternoon, as we sat in the office, she looked at the long row of leather-bound volumes that lined the shelves. She said, "It's so much paper, Mrs. Gable. Isn't there a more modern way?" I smiled. "Yes, there is," I said, and I spent the next week teaching her how to use the new encrypted, cloud-based archival system I had insisted the town purchase. I taught her how to create redundant, off-site backups, the old ways and the new ways. They weren't enemies. They were partners. The physical record for its permanence, its tangible link to the past, the digital record for its accessibility, its searchability, its security. Eleanor would have approved. On my last day, the new interim mayor held a small ceremony for me. They gave me a plaque and a key to the city. Sarah Jenkins was there, and she gave me a hug. She whispered, "Thank you." I whispered back, "You did the work. You told the story." After the small reception, I went back to my office one last time. It was empty now, my personal effects packed in a single cardboard box. It didn't feel sad. It felt right. My work was done. The record was safe. Before I left, I took down the oldest volume, the first one Eleanor Pynchon had ever shown me. I opened it to a random page from 1952. Her elegant, spidery script told a story of a zoning dispute, but the tiny symbols in the margins told a deeper story of greed and compromise. I ran my fingers over the page. 40 years. It was never about revenge. It was about this continuity, this unbroken chain of witness. I had kept the faith. I had protected the flock. I had faced the wolf, and the library was still standing. So, that's my story. The story of how a small-town clerk and her 40 years of notes brought down a corrupt political machine. I tell you this not to brag, but to make a point. You, right now, watching this, you have more power than you think. Maybe you're not a town clerk with a secret code, but you are a witness to your own life, to your own workplace, to your own community. You see things. You know things. You have a sense of what is right and what is wrong. Don't ever let anyone convince you that your voice is too small, that your observations don't matter. Don't let the charismatic bullies of the world make you feel like a relic. The world is saved not by grand gestures, but by the small daily acts of integrity. It's saved by the people who do their jobs with diligence and honor. It's saved by the people who, when they see something wrong, they write it down. They remember. They bear witness. Your personal ledger, the one you keep in your heart and your mind, is the most powerful weapon you have. It was never about revenge for me. It was about the truth. The truth, in the end, is all that matters. The minutes always remember, and so should you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the quiet one in the room who sees everything, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you saw the truth when no one else did. And please, share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their own quiet strength. And of course, hit that subscribe button for more stories about how the overlooked and underestimated can and do change the world. Thank you for listening.